discipline and attitude of the mind. It requires critical, informed curiosity and courage to see the world as it is rather than how it would be. Now, I want to do a little activity. Look around the room and notice everything that is dark blue and count it. Okay. Did everyone notice everything that's dark blue? Now, did anyone notice during that duration that there was a green plant behind me? No, because we were so focused on that dark blue. Where are they? So, this activity depicts how most of us perceive the world and ourselves. We are infiltrated in our issues, which is the dark blue, and we are not aware of the world around us, which is everything in this room that we forgot to look at. If we are not aware of the world around us, how can we help ourselves, better yet, make this a better place to live? Are we creating intentional blindness from our own issues? How can mindfulness disseminate our tunnel vision and be able to see everything around us in a positive light? From this activity, I want you to think throughout this seminar how mindfulness can impact our better living. This is our seminar. Now, I have amazing speakers to introduce. First to our grand stage is Peter Hayes. Peter Hayes is an active member of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. He has done lectures on the doctrine in Miami, Atlantic, New York City, and the 9th Spiritist Symposium in Stamford, Connecticut. He was the editing staff for the Spirits book by the U.S. Spiritist Federation and helped with Love and Light English editions of Diary of the Council, Love Existing Among Us, and A Shipwrecked Life. Peter has a long background in theater as an electrician, carpenter, and playwright. Currently, he's involved in commercial real estate with his brother. He will be doing a lecture on Does Your Worldview Impact Your Emotional Health? So can we introduce Peter Hayes? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good clap game.
That's better. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Howdy. This is better. My grandfather on my mother's side was born poor. He grew up in the state of Texas in what's called the Texas Panhandle. And it was an area that was very rural. People were kind of rough around the edges in that part of the country. And this was a little over 100 years ago. And he lived with my great-grandparents, and he was the oldest of 6 kids. And my grandfather was only 11 at a time when my great-grandmother was very religious. And my great-grandfather was not very happy. And at the age of 11, when my grandfather was 11, my great-grandfather walked out on the family and abandoned them, never to return. So at the age of 11, my grandfather, who was the oldest of 6 kids, had to help my great-grandmother provide for the family. Now, my grandfather was a cowboy, an honest-to-God cowboy. He used to work as a ranch hand. He could rope a calf quickly, and he won a contest doing that as a young man. And he could twirl a rope and do rope tricks. And he once said to me that if I ran across the lawn, he could lasso me and capture me. Fortunately, I was not dumb enough to actually put him to the test. Because imagine, My grandfather also had a very strong work ethic, and he was ambitious. And by the time he was an adult, after he married my grandmother, he went west to Washington State. And he worked in construction, and he got a degree in engineering. And by 1931, when this country was now in the midst of the worst economic depression of its history, my grandfather got involved in an organization called the Works Progress Administration, which was one of the government's programs to try to put people to work. And my grandfather was 29 or so, thereabouts. By the time he was 34, he was put in charge of the entire Western Division of the Works Progress Administration, which oversaw the 11 Western states. He worked for Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was President Roosevelt's Secretary of Commerce and a very close advisor to President Roosevelt. So my grandfather learned a great deal in doing this, and he also realized once before and during the time of World War II that the West Coast was going to explode economically after the war ended. It was an industrial economy, and it was obvious to him, and he was right. And what he did was he got involved in private industry, and he did pretty well, and he accomplished a great deal in his life. He had a lot to be proud of, proud in the good sense of that word. And yet, about 7 years or so before he passed, he was talking to my mother one day, and he said, you know, in spite of everything I've done, it hasn't really made me happy. And when I heard that, I remember going, wow, really? Because I remember looking up to him and thinking, wow, he did so much, it was something to be really proud of. And yet it didn't make him happy. His worldview was one of trying to prosper, trying to get ahead. Was it wrong? Was he wrong to be pursuing this? Well, my grandfather was one of many, many examples of trying to pursue the American dream. You've heard of the American dream, right? Right? The American dream, though, good to find the right button. The American dream is actually a term that was coined not too long ago, back in 1931, and it was coined by James Truslow Adams, who was a historian. And he did it in a book called The Epic America, and he was trying to explain or examine what is America's worldview and what are the values of America's worldview. And what he points out is that the American dream is a land in which life should be better and that everyone has an opportunity to advance according to their ability and their merit. He also goes on to say, look, the American dream is not just about motor cars and higher wages and stuff like that. That's a part of it. But he was also saying that it is about social order. It is about having a society in which everyone who's capable of work or capable of fulfilling their self-potential has the ability to advance in some way, regardless of where they came from. It doesn't matter what environment you grew up in. And this is a very different mindset, different worldview from, say, classic Europe, which was always based on divine right monarchy and the idea that wherever you were born, whatever class you were born in, you were going to stay there. There wasn't social advancement per se. And when we think of the American dream, there's a lot of ways to think about it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, these individuals. But all these people have certainly realized the American dream in some way. I don't know if you know about Mary Barra or not, but she's the current CEO of General Motors. And so is Indra Nooyi, the current CEO of Pepsi. There are two of many examples of how women are now in the positions, upper echelons of power. And in terms of our overall history, we're at the very beginning of this, right? Just the infancy of this. That's an example of the American dream. These people are all enterprising individuals. They happen to be ones that are focused in business. Again, I could have selected a lot of people. Henry Ford had a profound impact on modern life because Henry Ford is the one in developing the Ford Motor Company. In the 1920s, he developed mass production. He didn't invent the car and he didn't invent the assembly line, but he certainly elevated it to a level that it became possible for middle-class individuals to actually buy a car, which up to that point was a huge luxury. My grandfather met Henry Ford, and he was in his office, and he said, the thing that really impressed me was there was a plaque on Henry Ford's desk that said, "If you think, you can." That really blew my grandfather away because what he realized was if you have an idea, if there's something you have a goal, yes, it is possible to accomplish it. And that became a big credo in terms of a worldview for my grandfather. Now, these individuals are not saints. Some of them have been accused of being monopolistic. In 1996, about 2 years or so after Amazon was underway, Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, was asked, what's your favorite fish? And he laughed heartily and said, well, I guess it would have to be a piranha. Henry Ford, as much as he was an industrial genius, which my grandfather called him, he was also anti-Semitic, unfortunately. And while these individuals are not perfect, they've accomplished a lot, and they're the more positive side of the American dream, but the American dream definitely has a dark side. The darker side of the American dream is when people are primarily preoccupied with just accumulating wealth and not much else. The Wolf of Wall Street, for instance, is about a guy who wants to make as much money as possible, and yet he has no real idea what to do with it. And he's basically a criminal and makes no bones about it. So the darker side of the American dream can be summed up as people who are self-indulgent, people who have really no plan for the future, and people who just are basically living for themselves and not much else. In The Wolf of Wall Street is just one example. These guys can't party enough, can't do enough drugs and sex and all that stuff. And really the question in that movie is not, are they going to crash and burn? It's a question of how soon. So they really produce nothing. Death of a Salesman is another aspect of the American dream in that he's basically not able, he's not a criminal, but he can't really get ahead. And he's barely getting by, and all he can think about is being rich. And he lives in a dream world. In other words, what he can't do is actually figure out how to complete a task. He has these big dreams, but he lives in a dream world, so he doesn't know how to accomplish a task. And part of the American dream would be the ability to accomplish a task as a worldview. But the thing is, when people think about the American dream, they certainly think about material gain, right? Materialism, that sort of thing. But James Truslow Adams wrote his book, The American Epic, or Epic America, because he was worried. And he was worried because he said, look, money making and all that has its role. But the thing is, people feel like that's an end unto itself, and it's kind of mimicking some sort of moral value. So they're misjudging what the American dream is. And what he says is that in terms of the intentions of this country and intentions of what he calls the American dream, it's very much also about quality and spiritual values. So the darker side of the American dream is when people distort these values and fixate on money, possessions. And if you're really bad, it's those who simply can't ever have enough and are never happy with what they have. He goes on to say that, of course, a lot of people came here to prosper. People were poor. There was a big wave of immigration into this country in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and of course it goes on to this day. But that's not all that the American dream is about. It's about fulfilling one's inner potential. It is about the ability to try and develop inward as well as whatever we accomplish outward. Also, he points out that sometimes in our struggle to make a living, people kind of forget how to live. My mother was born in Washington State after my grandmother and grandfather moved there. By the time she was 16, they had moved 9 times. So guess what? My mother had a hard time making lasting friendships as a kid. And that's because my grandfather would get an opportunity to go from one place to the next while working for the government, and he took it. Now, this was the Great Depression. He was lucky to have a job, right? So he did what he had to do. But at the same time, did it take a toll on the family? Yes, absolutely. So it's a difficult balance sometimes. But he's also, James Trussell Adams is again saying that we have to be mindful about what we can do to work on ourselves inward, and it's not just about trying to make money. So, furthermore, there have been studies that have demonstrated that when people are overly preoccupied with the accumulation of wealth, that that's their #1 priority in some way, there are consequences to that. You have problems connecting with people. You're liable to have actually lower productivity in some cases. You may actually have issues with vitality, depression, more anxiety, in other words, all kinds of potential behavior disorders. And furthermore, a lot of times people who are really motivated to attain financial success as their primary goal are because they're struggling with a low security or even a lack of well-being. Was my grandfather insecure? Absolutely. He was very confident about in many ways, but beneath all that was a lot of insecurity because he was a guy from a place where he didn't get much education and he was trying to deal with people who were much more educated than he was, and that was difficult. And he was under a lot of pressure. And when he passed away at the age of 72, it was his 3rd heart attack. It's been pointed out in studies that when people have more self-acceptance as more of their focus for themselves, that they're less likely to have behavior disorders. So if we're supposed to think about focusing inward, if that's a healthier worldview, how can we do that? Well, certainly, Spiritism is an excellent way to do that. Kardec, in coining the word Spiritism, makes the point that he was trying to distinguish it from spiritualism, and what he says about spiritualism is it's the exact opposite of materialism. Materialism in this case means that it's the belief that our total existence is just us and our physical bodies and the workings of our brain, and that's pretty much it. And spiritualism rejects that. But Spiritism differs from spiritualism because it's more of a focus on spirits and the existence of the spirit world. And so Spiritism focuses more on its relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world. And it also says that we obviously have a soul. But in having a soul, we human beings are kind of in a unique spot. And what is meant by that in the Spirit's book is that the soul's kind of 3 basic parts. There's the vital soul, the intellectual soul, and the spiritual soul. The vital soul is just all organic beings. So that can be plants, animals, human beings. The intellectual soul is just animals and human beings. And we humans are unique in that we're the only ones that have a spiritual soul. In other words, a spiritual soul gives us the capacity to advance and to progress. And in having a spiritual soul, we have all kinds of stuff to deal with in terms of free will and so forth. And then question 132 of the Spirit's book points out that the vehicle through which we advance is reincarnation, that it is God's tool for how we advance. And that's why we have reincarnation in multiple lifetimes, and that reincarnation is in part, we are in our physical bodies so that we can be in harmony with the material state. And in that, that's what allows us to accomplish various missions, and it gives us the opportunity to contribute to the common good in some way. And the common good can just be dealing with our own families, for instance. It doesn't have to be having a profound impact on society as a whole. So there's a lot of ways to understand what the common good might mean. And naturally, in being in the physical world, we have trials, missions, and all kinds of things, and that we have to go through struggles all the time. I had a bit of a struggle to get here on time, and I'm thankful I did, but there was a lot of traffic out there. And so I was thinking, well, if I don't get here on time, what's plan B going to be? And stuff like that. But it worked out, and it was fine. And that's just like a trivial example of all the kinds of things that people have to deal with that are trials. And yet, the reason for trials and missions and learning and so forth is that they give us that opportunity to learn. And in going through different struggles and so forth, Spiritism says that we have to struggle in order to advance, but we don't have to be masochists about it. We don't have to be looking for struggle as if it's somehow going to be really good for us, just bring it on. It's not about that at all. It is about the fact that life is difficult, life is full of challenges, and we have to try to handle those as best we can. And rather than complain about it or be feeling like we're put upon, it's more an opportunity to learn. And that's why we go through these. But the other thing is, we're supposed to be in harmony with the material state. In other words, we learn by being here in the physical world. So does that mean that if we're supposed to focus more on our spiritual advancement, if we're supposed to find how to overcome trials and focus on ourselves emotionally and all that, does that mean that we should shun wealth, shun materialism, and basically say that money is bad and all that? Not at all. That's not what Spiritism says. It says in the Gospel according to Spiritism, it talks about the wise use of wealth. And what Spiritism is saying in that is, look, wealth is obviously a big test. It is in many ways, if one has wealth, it's a bigger test than the trial of poverty, because there are a lot of temptations that come with wealth. The capacity to spend is greater. It can bring out all kinds of desires, lust, and so forth. And it is a source of pride and so forth. But the way of looking at it is that wealth is really just a tool. Wealth is neither bad nor good. It depends on what our intentions are. And the Gospel talks about the parable of Jesus, where the young man goes to Jesus and says to him, what do I need to do to achieve eternal life? And he thinks he's got most of it figured out. Jesus says, follow the 10 Commandments. Okay, I don't commit adultery. Good. I'm not hating anybody. I haven't killed anybody. That's good. I'm honoring my parents. Good. And so forth. And then Jesus finally says, now you need to sell your possessions. And the guy goes, oh, man. And he walks away, right? Right? But the thing is, what's really meant by that? Does it mean that you have to give up all of your worldly possessions and go barefoot off into the universe and so forth? Well, some people do that and go into a monastery, and that's a perfectly valid way to practice Christianity. It's where you choose a life of reflection, and that works for some people. But that's not what we necessarily have to be doing, because Kardec puts it this way. He says, although wealth is difficult, it's not impossible obstacle to salvation. And in terms of seeing wealth as a tool, what does that mean? Well, Kardec points out that if we were to basically shun wealth, that means maybe we would have to outlaw it because it's a source of evil and nobody can handle it. Therefore, it's, forbidden. But then if we did that, we would have to do away with work. And if we did away with work, Kardec points out, then we would be reduced to this primitive state. So Kardec says that's silly. We don't need to be terrified of wealth. We don't need to shun it. We don't need to be ashamed of it. We don't need to judge everyone who has wealth. And by the way, when I say wealth, I'm not just talking about somebody who's a multimillionaire or a billionaire like some of the people I showed you before. Wealth is simply the act of earning money and spending, and you may not have a lot left over, but you're still in the activity of acquiring wealth. Should we fear that? No, absolutely not. That's not the point at all, because it is a way through which we learn. It is part of the law of progress. So to be shunning wealth would be to say no work, which contradicts the law of progress. What's the law of progress? Well, I thought you'd never ask, so I'll be happy to share some thoughts with you. The law of progress is one of God's laws, which is in the Spirit's book. And some of the points that are emphasized in the law of progress is that humanity must progress. We do not go backwards, we only go forwards. We may hum along at the same spot for quite a while, and we may be stuck in the same place for quite a while, but one way or another we're going to advance. So we don't go backwards, we don't unlearn anything. We may forget, but we don't unlearn. Furthermore, it's built on the assumption that human beings are born imperfect, yet we have the capacity to advance. I talked before about having a spiritual soul. Well, that is our capacity to advance. And also, not all of us are going to progress equally because we learn at different stages. Some of us learn faster than others. Some of us learn slowly because we're stubborn and we find ways to resist progress. But everybody has the same opportunity to advance. It doesn't matter who you are. In other words, the law of progress and much of what Spiritism says is very similar to the positive full worldview of the American dream. That is, when it's practiced in the most positive way possible. Because the American dream says everyone should have the opportunity to advance if you have the capability to do so. It's not all that it says. It certainly emphasizes kindness and compassion in there as well. But nevertheless, that's part of what the American dream stands for. Now, in the law of progress, it's always a mix of intellectual progress and moral progress. In intellectual progress, people usually gain that first, and then moral progress doesn't always stay up with intellectual progress, and it's a bit of a struggle. It can be a big struggle, a huge struggle sometimes. But there's nevertheless this need to keep intellectual progress and moral progress together. In question 785, we struggle with progress, and it says one of the biggest obstacles to progress, 785 meaning question 785 in the Spirit's book, one of the big obstacles to progress is pride and selfishness. That's a moral struggle mostly. But what can happen sometimes is if people are very focused on material gain and wealth and even in love with it, well, that may be as a result of intellectual progress, but it's also a sign that they're struggling with moral progress. Spiritism, in terms of the law of progress, says that it can help contribute to progress by destroying materialism, which it sees as a plague on society. What I think it's really getting at here is that materialism, if we really believe, besides being materialistic, if we think that everything is about the here and now and we're just in our physical bodies and that's it and there's no future, well, that's what Spiritism is trying to get away from and is trying to destroy, as it were, is this worldview, this mindset that we don't need to think about the future. But if we overcome this materialistic mindset, we not only are mindful of the future, but we're working today toward the future. Again, another aspect of the more positive side of the American dream is that you're working today for a better tomorrow, and that is worth doing and has the capacity to evoke positive change in the long run. Does this process need to be speeded up somehow? Well, not necessarily, because if God swooped in and did all kinds of miracles, then we wouldn't have to learn from the experiences. And even if God did do miracles like that, would it actually convince anybody to change? Not necessarily. So progress happens at the pace that it needs to happen. It can be slow, sometimes it's frustrating, but if you have the long-term view, and that's what reincarnation encourages one to think, encourages a person's thought process to think that way. If you really have the long-term view, then you're not worrying so much about the current events or what's going on or how long something might take. So, in terms of the future, I've been talking about the United States, and I don't mean to be picking on the United States at all, but I'm going to keep that focus just a little bit longer in terms of asking this question of where are we going? You know, people look at the way things are today and it might be tempting to say, well, you know, is this country going to hell in a handbasket? Well, the Spirit's book has some commentary about nations as a whole that I want to share with you, which I think are very interesting. It points out that nations, it points this out in questions 788, 793. Nations that are primarily about territorial expansion and so forth, hegemony, that are, in other words, a little more materialistically minded or put more value on materialism, are likely to, nations whose selfish laws are opposed to the progress of enlightenment are likely not to last, because light basically kills darkness and that charity kills selfishness. And yet nations and individuals do have a spiritual life, and the more a nation tries to pass laws that are in harmony with God, the more that nation's going to survive. When I say laws that are in harmony with God, I don't mean to legislate morality. Just to make a quick point, James Truslow Adams, in talking about the troubles with America, was commenting about the 1920s. And in the 1920s, it had prohibition, which made alcohol illegal. They were trying to legislate morality by curbing people's free will in that respect, and it turned out to be a big disaster. It gave us organized crime. That's what organized crime developed from, because it wasn't organized in the way it was after that. So laws that are more fair and in harmony with God, but not necessarily legislating morality per se. The Spirit's book also goes to say that the ones that are the most advanced nations are the ones that basically have the least amount of selfish greed and pride. In fact, I'm just going to read this. The ones whose habits are morally better, more intellectual than material, and where intelligence can develop freely, it is the one with the greatest amount of kindness, good faith, compassion, and generosity. It is where prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love for one's neighbor. Its laws do not allow privileges and are the same for every member of its society. It's where human life, beliefs, opinions are respected, and where is the smallest number of poor and unhappy individuals. Finally, it is a nation where people are willing to work and are guaranteed the essentials for survival. Very similar to the full view of what the American dream should be. Now, does the United States really follow this? Well, I would put it this way. Yes and no, and the jury's still out, because we're not done yet, right? Yes, racism has been institutionalized in this country. That's not good. Yes, it has changed and it's getting better. No, we're not through the end of this by a long shot, but progress has been made. Look at what, as I mentioned before, the progress women have made. This country was very different, like most of the world, not too long ago, right? You all know that. Does this country emphasize kindness and compassion and fairness? Not 100%, but a lot of the laws do. It is possible to get justice in this country. It doesn't work 100%. When you think about the things going on today, you have to ask yourself, is this how it's always going to be? Is it never going to change? Well, that depends on the people. It depends on whether or not people take responsibility. And the way we can all take responsibility is by developing our inner selves. Because if we develop our inner selves, then we have the capacity to really evoke more of a positive change. And it's not that materialism doesn't have a role. We need to deal with the physical world. But it doesn't have to be the thing that we worship unto itself. Because everything we have in terms of material possessions are just temporary gifts from God, and that's it. And if we really want to evoke a positive change, you can do that. You don't have to be someone who's out there on the streets all the time protesting. If you want to, that's fine. But a positive change can just happen by what we do, even within our own families, just by fostering as much kindness and goodwill and the kinds of values that we all share in common that are values that are compatible with the teachings of Jesus, and not just Jesus, but religions around the world in many respects. So we all have the capacity to evoke these changes. And one way that we can do that is simply by thinking more about what we think and thinking about the consequences of our thoughts. In the Andre Louise series, the second book in that series is The Messengers. And there's an interesting quote from one of Andre Louise's mentor spirits who tries to make a point to him. And he says that each one of us, through our lives, carries the inner archives of all we thought and said. And while those who live to do evil carry within them the hell they create for themselves, the good reveal the living paradise they have generated in their hearts. This idea that our thoughts can either put us in a living hell, or if they're positive or generally more emphasis on the good, that they can put us through more of a paradise, is very much a summary of the book Heaven and Hell, the fourth book in the Spiritist doctrine. But also, this is the week of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in Judaism, which are the two biggest, and Yom Kippur is the most important holiday of the year. And yes, I come from a Christian background, Two of my great-grandparents were deeply religious Christian women, and yet my wife is Jewish, and so I honor that by participating in Judaism to the extent that we do. And I mention this because Judaism talks about inscribing everything we think and do in the book of life. It's very similar to what I just said here about how our inner thoughts get recorded. It's a very similar concept, I would say. And it emphasizes this period of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is about reflection. It's a period where we have to think about who we are, what we've accomplished, what we need to work on. In other words, it's about us taking responsibility for ourselves and not blaming others or blaming the world at large and so forth. But because we have spiritual soul, we have intellectual and moral progress and free will and all that, we have the capacity to evoke these changes. It's up to us whether we're going to evoke these changes. I'm going to end with my grandfather, whom I started with, because about 2 years before he passed away, this would have been the early 70s, my grandfather wrote a letter to my brother. And my grandfather said to him, look, you probably think I'm a big money grabber, and in some respects you're right. He was very aware of the counterculture of the 1960s, because we lived in a place where a lot of that was in our backyard. But he also wrote the letter not because of that. He was trying to say to my brother, I learned a lot through the act of work that I want to share with you. Because the act of work mattered to him. The act of doing one's best mattered to him. And he gave a lot of different kinds of advice that were focused on that. One of the things he said is that our thoughts do matter. Kind of like what I just read to you here. He said, never say anything bad about somebody unless you can say something good about them. So he was emphasizing, don't judge people. You can't know what a person's been through unless you've actually been in their shoes. And it's very easy for all of us to judge, right? I was talking about this recently in one of the English groups I'm in, about how easy it is to just get into that mode. And yet we have to try and do our best not to get into those patterns. I'm going to share with you a little poem that my grandfather put in the letter that he gave to my brother. This is from Ella Wheeler Wilcox. I think it's kind of in a similar vein as what I just read to you from the Messengers. You never can tell what your thoughts will do in bringing you hate or love. For thoughts are things, and their airy wings are swifter than carrier doves. They follow the law of the universe. Each thing must create its kind, and they speed over the track to bring you back whatever went out from your mind. Does our worldview impact our emotional health? The question of this lecture. The answer is, of course it does. How could it not? Another way to look at that question, though, is, do we have to remain stuck in our worldview? And the answer is absolutely not. Spiritism offers us a very thorough way to think about how we can evolve our worldview. Our worldview can change, and it does change. Again, that's part of what the law of progress is about. So no matter what's going on today, no matter how upsetting things can be, keep the long-term view in mind. Thank you.